There was not a cloud in the early spring sky, and gardeners grew the grass long, thick, and green in anticipation of today's invasion of 30,000 people. What a great day for an Easter egg roll, Jake thought, as he and Catherine carefully crossed the White House lawn. Jake was concerned about Catherine's safety among the crowd of children and their parents that filled the area. But Catherine insisted that she felt fine and that her pregnancy would not be a problem. However, he held her expanding waist tightly and kept a close eye on any overly excited child who might encounter her in search of the brightly decorated eggs. "We are also hatching our own egg," Jake thought proudly. Suddenly, screams were heard ahead, and the crowd went towards their source. Then applause and laughter filled the air, and the mass of people parted to reveal Calvin Arthur, call me Cap, Pressman, President of the United States. The man whom Time magazine named America's Best Salesman in its Person of the Year issue, wore a bunny costume, including a tail and long ears. Secret Service agents tried unsuccessfully to hold back the crowd as the president waved to Jake and Catherine and shouted, "How is my beloved aide doing today?" Catherine smiled widely and gave him a thumbs up. He smiled back at her and then began jumping around in a circle to the delight of the children. Jake had to admire it. Only Cap Pressman could pull off something like this, he thought to himself. The president continued to move through the crowd, and Jake was pleased to note that there were almost as many photographers as there were children following him. Jake smiled reluctantly. The man really knew how to create a photo moment for himself. Catherine spotted some White House staffers she knew in the crowd, and she and Jake began to make their way in their direction. Suddenly, she screamed sharply and doubled over. Then she groaned and collapsed to the ground in front of Jake's frightened eyes. He quickly crouched down next to her, trying to support her head. "What's wrong, honey? What's wrong?" he asked urgently. But Catherine seemed to be in such pain that she could not even speak. To Jake's horror, he noticed a dark red stain on the skirt of her Easter dress. In fear and anguish, Jake raised his head and began screaming madly, "We need help! We need a doctor!" The crowd that had gathered around them suddenly parted like the Red Sea before Moses, and the president himself stood over them. The big man turned to the black-suited Secret Service agent and barked, "Take her to the helipad! Launch the C unit and tell them I want her taken to Johns Hopkins. Do it now!" he ordered. As if by magic, 3 more agents suddenly appeared around Catherine. Pushing Jake aside, they picked her up and began running through the crowd, with Jake trying to keep up. The journey across the South Lawn seemed like an eternity to Jake, but in fact, they covered the distance in less than 3 minutes, even with the crowds of people filling the lawn. The large rotors of the Sikorsky Sea King helicopter had already begun to spin, and the agents quickly placed Catherine inside. As Jake ran to catch up, a strong arm reached out and literally pulled him into the plane just as the wheels began to leave the ground. He saw Catherine lying on several seats and moved over to her to take her hand. The engine noise died down as soon as the door closed, but Jake still heard the roar in his ears. Holding Catherine's hand, he looked out the window and saw rooftops and buildings he didn't recognize fly by below them, creating a dizzying effect. Once again, the trip seemed like an eternity to Jake, but suddenly the C unit was hovering over the helipad on the roof of the Brady building at Johns Hopkins Hospital. The stretcher team waited, and as soon as the large helicopter landed, they quickly carried Catherine off the helipad and across the ramp to another building where the elevator waited. Jake tried to follow her, but the paramedics moved so quickly that he was left behind. After agonizing minutes on the roof, the elevator returned and a hospital employee stepped out and escorted Jake to the correct floor and through a maze of corridors to the waiting room. For the next 2 hours, Jake alternated between sitting and walking around the waiting room. Finally, a figure in a white coat walked up to the front desk and said loudly, "Phillips, Mr. Jacob Phillips?" Jake stood up and hurried towards the woman. "How is she?" he asked urgently. The doctor calmly led him down the corridor away from the waiting room so they could talk a little alone. "Mr. Phillips, I'm Dr. Nancy Liu, Catherine's gynecologist. Your wife is out of danger," she said softly. We're going to keep her overnight for observation, but if nothing unexpected happens, you can take her home in the morning." Jake released the breath he had been holding, and tears of gratitude appeared in his eyes. But his relief was short-lived. "And the child, doctor? What's wrong with the child?" The doctor looked at him without expression. "I'm sorry, Mr. Phillips, but your wife lost her baby. She suffered a miscarriage." Jake felt as if he had been stabbed in the chest. "Oh God, why? Why did this happen?" The doctor looked at him with sympathy. "Mr. Phillips, it is important that you understand that neither you nor your wife did anything wrong. In fact, 15% to 20% of all pregnancies end in miscarriage, and that is if the woman knows she is pregnant. An even higher percentage of mothers suffer spontaneous miscarriages without even realizing they are pregnant." She stroked Jake's hand. "The most important thing right now is that there is nothing stopping you and your wife from trying to conceive again. Many women who have miscarriages get pregnant again and have healthy, normal children. It's not the end of the world." Jake nodded, still devastated over the loss of their child, but somewhat comforted by the doctor's words. "And Catherine? Can I see her?" "We gave her a sedative to help her sleep, but you can stop by and see her if you want." Jake followed the doctor into Catherine's room and cautiously peered through the door. Seeing his wife sleeping, he crept up to her. Her face looked tired, but to Jake, she was the most beautiful woman in the world. He kissed her forehead. "I love you, darling. We will get through this," he whispered. Then he turned and left. When he finally returned home to Falls Church, it was dark. Even though he hadn't eaten anything since the morning, Jake couldn't bring himself to even think about food. Instead, he walked out onto their deck and collapsed into a chair to stare into the darkness. Now that he knew Catherine was safe and cared for, his own pain returned, along with a flood of memories. Jake had been dreaming about having a baby for a long time. In fact, even longer than Catherine. She insisted that they both should establish their careers before starting a family. When she finally agreed that the time was right, she didn't get pregnant right away. Doctors declared them both healthy and fully capable of having children. Patience and a lot of practice were the only recommendations for the young couple. Now that lightning had finally struck and Catherine was pregnant, it was meant to be. As the night air grew colder, Jake began to remember how he and Catherine met. He had just received his law degree from the University of Nebraska, but instead of committing himself to a job at a law firm, Jake decided to try out the political process. He wasn't interested in running for office himself, but he wanted to work for the candidate and try to make a difference. The candidate he chose to work for was a promising recruit from Oklahoma named Cap Pressman. What struck Jake about Pressman was the way the candidate combined a populist agenda with political pragmatism. Cap seemed to have a talent for bringing political opponents together to work out compromises acceptable to both sides. The fact that Cap was also young and from another prairie state finally convinced Jake. Pressman had just begun his campaign for his party's nomination when Jake arrived at the campaign headquarters in Oklahoma City to volunteer. When he asked a college student who was in charge, the young man nodded toward a panoramic glass office amid a bustle of workers, wall posters, phone banks, and other campaign paraphernalia. A blonde stood in the center of the office, talking on the phone with enthusiasm. Jake looked at her in amazement. She was not a model, but he considered her the most attractive woman he had ever seen. He walked up to the office and waited by the door until she hung up and noticed him. "Well, who are you and what do you need?" she demanded. "I'm Jake Phillips," he muttered, "and I'm here to volunteer." "Great," she said, and grabbed a piece of paper from her desk to hand it to him. "Here is a list of 50 potential donors. Call them and ask for the specified amount, and don't take no for an answer." As he stood looking at her in admiration, she waved the leaf impatiently in front of his face. "Come on, get started." He blushed, took the paper from her, and walked over to the row of phones to start ringing. Later that night, when everything had calmed down, he returned to the office. The young woman had taken off her shoes and was sitting with her feet on the table, clearly tired. Jake found her even more attractive than at first glance. She felt his presence and looked at him with irritation. "Well, have you called all these donors?" she asked sternly. "Yes," Jake confirmed, "and I've received some promises of help." The woman's face relaxed. "Good job," she said, as if to a child. "If you can come tomorrow, we still have a lot of calls to make." Jake paced the room nervously. "I was actually hoping to do something more meaningful for the company." She looked at him suspiciously. "And what do you think you're qualified to do?" "Well, I'm a lawyer," he said. The woman jumped to her feet and looked at Jake with regret. "Oh God, why didn't you tell me right away? We desperately need legal counsel. Sit down and tell me about yourself." This is how their acquaintance began. Catherine, who began working with Pressman when he was U.S. Representative from Oklahoma, has taken on an increasingly larger role in the campaign, as has Jake. At first, Catherine insisted that their relationship remain strictly professional. It was a difficult time for Jake. But things got better after Pressman returned to Oklahoma on the campaign trail and made a point of meeting with the lawyer Catherine had talked so much about. With his friendly style and strong personality, Pressman strengthened Jake's support and increased his loyalty. In turn, Jake must have made a favorable impression because Catherine then let Jake know how impressed Pressman was with their meeting. After this, Catherine warmed up to Jake, and they began dating outside of work almost immediately. They married shortly after the general election. After the election, Pressman's campaign became the object of study by political scientists. Coming from a state with little influence in Congress, Pressman had little national recognition when he started his company. His performance in the primaries in Iowa and New Hampshire was weak, and he was widely expected to withdraw from the race. But he did much better in the Colorado and Minnesota caucuses, and then began to gain real momentum in southern states. It was tough for a while, but impressive wins in the New England states put him in the lead. When he easily won the California primary, the nomination was his. Pressman's strength in New England was no fluke. At Yale Law School, he met and successfully attracted Savannah Hamilton, who was not only a descendant of Alexander Hamilton, but also the daughter of Horace Hamilton, the senior senator from Massachusetts. One observer called their marriage less a love affair than a union of political dynasties. In any case, there was no doubt that the senator's influence played a significant role in Pressman winning the nomination. In contrast, the general election went smoothly. The opposition candidate was vice president of the previous administration. Long involved in politics, the vice president had many connections but limited skills on the ballot. The photogenic Cap Pressman won over the electorate with his humor, personal charm, and tireless energy. The final voting result was the second largest rout in history. It was obvious that Jake and Catherine would go to Washington to become part of the administration. Jake even wondered if his wife might be offered a cabinet position, but she didn't want to deal with it. Instead, she became one of Pressman's closest aides, whom he relied on, working loyally behind the scenes to make Pressman's star shine even brighter. It was a role she loved. Jake decided not to enter the administration, choosing to work at a large law firm in the Washington area. "One of us needs to make money and live a normal life," he told Catherine with a smile. And although he didn't tell her, by that time Jake had become a little wary of the absolute loyalty that Pressman expected from his men. Cap may have believed in the art of compromise, but he was not receptive to disagreements within his administration. Jake voted for Pressman's re-election, but he no longer idealized him as he once did. Jake suddenly shuddered, which brought him out of his thoughts. A glance at the thermometer in the backyard showed the temperature had dropped to 40 degrees as he sat there, reminiscing. Spring nights in Washington can still get pretty cold, he reminded himself as he walked back into the house. Soon after, he went to bed, setting his alarm to wake up early enough to get to Baltimore and Hopkins on time the next day. When he arrived at Catherine's room the next morning, he found her awake and sitting up in bed, her face illuminated by the bright April sun. But her expression was depressed, and her eyes reflected the emotional pain of losing her child. Jake rushed to her and hugged her tightly, but she returned his hug weakly. Her lack of warmth was painful, But Jake reminded himself that any pain he felt must be many times greater for Catherine. Trying to get her involved, he pointed to a huge arrangement of flowers that took up an entire corner of the room. "They are beautiful. Where are they from?" he asked. "From the White House," was all Catherine replied, so Jake walked over to look at the card. The flowers were indeed from the President and First Lady, both of whom personally signed wishes for Catherine's speedy recovery. When Jake called the hospital to make sure he could take Catherine home, a nurse advised him to bring a change of clothes for his wife. Now that Jake had handed her the bag, she asked him to leave the room while she changed. His request stung Jake, but he complied without protest. As he left the room, he met Catherine, the gynecologist, again doing her rounds. "Your wife is recovering well," Dr. Liu assured him, "but there are a few things you need to understand. Losing a child is not only emotionally traumatic for a woman, but also physically traumatic." When she became pregnant, Catherine's body began a complex series of hormonal changes, preparing for pregnancy, birth, and breastfeeding. These changes were abruptly interrupted by the miscarriage and must now begin the reverse process. This process, along with all the emotions she is going through, will make this a difficult time for her. I would advise you to be as patient as possible and supportive over the next few weeks because your wife will really need it. The good news is that most women recover physically quite quickly. However, the emotional side may take longer. In these cases, time is the best healer, and I expect it won't take too long for her mood and general condition to noticeably improve. If this isn't going to happen, there are medications I can prescribe to help her return to a more normal state of mind. The doctor wearily pushed her graying bangs back from her forehead and looked carefully at Jake. "Your wife really needs you. You will have to be patient and caring. Now, more than ever." As he drove Catherine home, the doctor's words continued to echo in his head, and he made a promise to himself that he would do everything he could to help his wife heal. The following days were some of the most difficult Jake had ever faced. He still had to deal with his own sadness over the loss of their unborn child, but his natural optimism kept him afloat. He clung to the hope that he and Catherine could try again and maybe have better luck this time. However, with Catherine, it was different. She spent most of the next few days at home in her room, only leaving when absolutely necessary, and when she did, she barely spoke to Jake. A week later, she stated that she had fully recovered and insisted on returning to work. But from an emotional point of view, it was a different story. She performed all her personal and work functions normally, but did so without showing any emotion. She continued to spend long periods alone, brooding, and shied away from his touch every time Jake tried to hug or pet her. As his own sadness subsided, Jake's concern for his wife continued to grow. It was as if the woman he loved had been replaced by an impenetrable, emotionless, and uncaring stranger. His anxiety increased, and he turned to his friends for advice, asking for their opinions and recommendations. They all agreed that Catherine was showing symptoms of depression. Everyone assured him that patience and loving care were his best strategies. The continued loss of intimacy and emotional connection was having an increasing impact on Jake, and after 2 months, the lack of sexual activity also began to seriously bother him. One night, he carefully broached the topic of resuming their sex life, with disastrous consequences. Catherine looked at him in shock and exclaimed, "If I never have sex with you again, I will die a happy woman." She then burst into tears and ran into their room, slamming the door and locking it. Intellectually, Jake knew she didn't mean what she said, but her words still hurt him. As he lay on the couch that night, unable to sleep, he couldn't help but think about their sex life together. Catherine had never been a very passionate woman. Jake's libido had always been stronger than hers. It was disappointing to him that she had a lower level of desire, but he loved her so much that he was willing to accept her for who she was. If nothing else, when they made love, it was almost exciting for Jake. Another thing he discovered about Catherine was that, unlike the women he had known before, she wasn't particularly interested in foreplay. All this thinking about sex only increased Jake's frustration, and he decided that he had to take some action. After much thought, he decided to try to make an appointment with Dr. Liu and ask her for help. The next morning, he called Dr. Liu's office and asked for an appointment. He was pleasantly surprised when the nurse came back on the line and said the doctor could see him at the end of the day. When he saw Dr. Liu, Jake wasted no time in immediately laying out his wife's situation as he saw it, describing the list of problems and symptoms he had observed. The doctor nodded as she listened, and when Jake finished, she told him that Catherine's symptoms, while not unprecedented, were on the more extreme end of typical reactions after a miscarriage. "It looks like Catherine is suffering from postpartum depression," she told Jake. When he looked confused, she explained, "You're used to hearing this term in connection with mothers who carry a baby to term and then suffer from postpartum depression. But it can also happen in women who have had a miscarriage, and the symptoms what they are experiencing may be just as severe. Given the circumstances, I will put her on Prozac. I like how it works because it seems to work faster than some of the newer antidepressants." As she wrote the prescription, Jake's long-repressed sense of loss resurfaced, and he threw up his hands. "I still don't understand how we could have lost the baby. We're both healthy. We ate healthy. Catherine was careful to avoid alcohol and drugs. What went wrong?" Dr. Liu looked at him with sympathy. "It's so hard to tell in cases like this, Mr. Phillips. It could be a chromosomal abnormality or an inappropriate immunological reaction. Your wife's abortion could play a role, or some undiagnosed—" "Wait a minute," Jake interrupted her. "Aborting my wife? Catherine never had an abortion." "Of course she did. Here it is," the doctor said, flipping through a file on her desk. "She had a vacuum aspiration abortion in February 2 years ago." "I didn't know anything about abortion. Show me that," Jake demanded, reaching across the table for the documents. Dr. Liu abruptly snatched the file from his hands and quickly closed it. "I'm sorry, Mr. Phillips, but the health insurance privacy laws of the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act absolutely prohibit me from sharing Catherine's medical records with you or anyone else without her express written permission." "But I'm her husband," Jake exclaimed. "It was my child who was aborted." "I'm sorry, Mr. Phillips, but my hands are tied." When Jake returned home from Baltimore, he was upset and confused. Each thought gave rise to more and more questions. How could Catherine have an abortion without telling me? Why did she do it when we were trying so hard to have a baby? Why did she hide it from me? If she hadn't had an abortion, would I have become a father already? Arriving home, he discovered that he had arrived before Catherine. Always a workaholic, Catherine had started staying longer and longer at work after her miscarriage, and Jake now wondered if she was deliberately trying to avoid him. It was almost 8 p.m. when he heard her car pull up to the house. He spent the entire time thinking about what he learned from Dr. Liu, and by this point, he was very upset. When Catherine entered the house, he immediately confronted her. "Why did you have an abortion 2 years ago?" he demanded. Catherine's eyes widened and her face turned red. "What? I never had an abortion. Who told you that?" she exclaimed. Jake was surprised, but didn't back down. "I saw Dr. Liu today. She told me." "She's lying," Catherine shouted. "It is not true." She then rushed into the bedroom, slamming the door behind her and locking it. Jake followed her, but heard her sobs through the door. He returned to the living room and fell onto the sofa, holding his head in his hands. "What the hell is going on?" he asked himself in despair. Catherine never left her room that evening, and the door remained locked the next morning, so Jake had to go to work in the same clothes. Luckily, he had a toothbrush and razor in the office, so he was able to make himself somewhat presentable. But his appearance did not reflect his emotional state, and he did very little work. At the end of the working day, he cautiously headed home, not knowing what awaited him in his once happy home. But to his surprise, Catherine was already at home and greeted him politely, as if nothing had happened. They ate dinner together, but Jake could feel acid building in his stomach. Finally, when he couldn't take it anymore, he began cautiously, "Honey, we need to talk." "There's nothing to talk about," Catherine interrupted him calmly. "I didn't have an abortion, and that's all you need to know. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some work to do." With that, she stood up from the table, leaving Jake sitting there in stunned silence. Over the next 2 days, Jake tried to raise the issue twice more, only to hear the exact same answer. There was no abortion. Finally, he decided to try a different approach with his wife. "Honey," he began over dinner, "I know you're feeling terrible about the miscarriage. When I saw Dr. Lou, she gave me a prescription that she said would help." When he handed her the recipe, she took it and then looked at him blankly. "Thank you, Jacob, but that's not necessary. I've fully recovered from my depression." With that, she tore up the recipe, threw the pieces into the trash, and went into the living room to read. While Catherine slept next to him late that night, Jake lay unable to sleep, constantly asking himself, "What should I do now?" He still couldn't find the answer. He knew he felt worse than the day they lost the child. In the morning, looking at himself in the mirror, the dark circles under his eyes clearly indicated how little sleep he had slept. Still, he forced himself to get dressed and go to work, if for no other reason than simply because he didn't know what else to do with himself. He ate a sandwich at his desk at noon, but then couldn't remember which one it was. Later, his self-pity was interrupted by his secretary, who informed him that he had a visitor from the White House. Surprised, he asked her to let the guest in, and then stood up and waited at his table, wondering who might have come and why. When the secretary returned, she was accompanied by an attractive woman who seemed to be about his age. She was of average height with dark, short-cropped hair. She was wearing a stylish culotte suit, and Jake couldn't help but notice that she looked very sporty. The woman came up and introduced herself. "My name is Helen Simmons," she said, extending her hand to Jake. "I'm from the U.S. Secret Service." Jake motioned for her to sit, and then politely but curiously asked, "How may I help you, Miss Simmons?" "Mr. Phillips. I am seconded to the First Lady and I am here on her behalf. Mrs. Pressman would like to meet with you today if possible." Jake was so stunned that he rudely blurted out, "Why does the First Lady want to see me?" The agent smiled and replied, "The First Lady should tell you that, sir, not me." Jake looked at her warily. "When would she like this meeting to take place?" The agent smiled again and said, "Now, if possible, sir, or as soon as you can. I have been instructed to wait for you and take you to the White House." Jake was puzzled by this strange turn of events, but decided he had nothing to lose by agreeing to accompany the Secret Service agent. After telling his secretary where he was going and seeing her eyes widen at the mention of the White House, Jake was ushered onto the sidewalk where a black Escalade was parked. Agent Simmons got behind the wheel and motioned for Jake to take the seat next to her. As they slowly made their way through Washington's traffic jams, the agent looked at Jake and said, "Let me express my condolences for the loss of your child." Surprised, Jake thanked her and then asked, "So you know about this?" "Yes, sir. I was on duty on Easter Monday. I was one of the agents who carried your wife to the helicopter." "Oh, I didn't know," Jake said awkwardly. "I mean, I didn't really pay attention to anything else. Anyway, thanks for everything you did to help us." "It's okay, sir," she said in a professional tone. She then looked at Jake and added, "Besides, I hope to be a mother someday too." "You have a husband?" Jake asked, and then wondered if he had said something wrong. But the agent smiled at him and shook her head. "No, I'm still searching. I thought I found the right one once, but he turned out to be frivolous. But that's okay, I'll find my happiness." At that point, they turned onto East Executive Avenue, and after Agent Simmons showed her credentials at the gate, they were allowed to drive up to the East Wing entrance. Simmons led Jake upstairs to the second floor, where the First Lady's office was located. Approaching the mezzanine, the agent knocked lightly on the door and then let Jake inside. There, he found the First Lady busy at her desk. She stood up and walked around to shake his hand. "Mrs. Pressman," he said, bowing slightly. She smiled graciously and led him to the sofa and chairs on one side of the work area. "We'll be more comfortable talking here," she said. As they sat down, her expression became more serious. "How is your wife, Mr. Phillips?" she asked softly. "Has she recovered from her loss?" Jake hesitated, not sure how to respond given everything that had happened. In the end, he took the easy way out and said, "She's doing as well as can be expected, ma'am. Thank you for asking." The First Lady nodded and then looked closely at Jake. "What about you, Jake? How are you feeling?" To his surprise, Jake's throat felt tight, and he tried to cover it up with a small cough. "It wasn't easy, ma'am. I really wanted to be a father." She reached out and lightly stroked his arm. "Men are always supposed to be strong and silent. It's easy to forget that they have feelings too." Jake nodded gratefully, not knowing what else to say. She pointed to the coffee set on the table in front of them and asked Jake if he would like to join her for a cup of coffee. He agreed, grateful for the opportunity to keep his hands busy. After she poured them both, Mrs. Pressman took a sip and, looking over the rim of her cup, asked Jake, "So, what do you think of my husband?" Jake froze, holding the cup halfway to his mouth, desperately trying to figure out how to respond. In the end, he chose a cautious answer. "As you know, I volunteered for his first presidential election," he said. The First Lady glared at him. "Yes, and I know you didn't volunteer for his re-election. Either way, you didn't really answer my question." Jake took a sip from his cup to give himself more time to think, but still felt unsure of what to say. In the end, he decided to be sincere. "The president has achieved some remarkable accomplishments, Mrs. Pressman," he said. "He overcame a budget impasse in Congress when no one thought it was possible, and I think he handled the crisis in Southeast Asia well." Mrs. Pressman listened intently. "But," she pushed. Jake sighed to himself. "But it bothers me that lately it's all about Cap Pressman and not the country. I think he's acting more like a king than a president, like he's promoting a cult of personality. There's even talk of repealing the 22nd Amendment so he could be running for a third term, and they say the president is pushing it behind the scenes. All of this makes me feel uneasy." He placed the cup on the table and leaned back, waiting for her reaction. "Very interesting," replied his interlocutor. She took another sip of her coffee and then looked at him again. "What are your views on marriage, Jake? Do you agree with the growing number of young people who seem to want to live together permanently without officially getting married? And for those who do get married, what about the trend of looking for relationships outside of marriage?" Jake was taken aback by the sudden change of topic, but this time he had no hesitation in answering. "Mrs. Pressman, I'm probably old-fashioned in this regard. I think that people who live together for years without marriage are afraid to commit, and I believe that commitment is necessary for a successful relationship, especially if the couple plans to have children. And as for all these services for finding extramarital affairs, I think they are pretty low." She put down her cup and looked at him carefully. "Have you ever been unfaithful to Catherine, Jake?" He was clearly offended. "No, ma'am, I haven't, and I never will. Never." "So you've never even been tempted?" "Can't say no, ma'am, but there's a big difference between experiencing temptation and acting on temptation." She looked at him for a long time and then suddenly stood up. As he hurried to follow her example, she extended her hand to him. "You're a good person, Jake Phillips. It's been nice getting to know you a little better. Unfortunately, I have my next appointment, but I hope we have a chance to talk again." As he shook her hand, Helen Simmons appeared as if by magic. As she began to escort Jake to the door, Mrs. Pressman stopped them. "Jake, take care of yourself, okay?" He smiled. "Yes, ma'am, I'll try, and thank you." With that, Agent Simmons escorted Jake from the White House to a waiting car. Jake was silent until they pulled out onto the street. Then he turned to the woman. "Have you been listening to our entire conversation?" She smiled. "Yes, Mrs. Pressman prefers that I remain alert with both ears and eyes. She feels safer this way." "Well, all I can say is that this was the weirdest conversation I've ever had." "I have no idea why she wanted to see me," Jake said, overcome with confusion. Helen looked at him. "In my experience, Mrs. Pressman is a fairly astute judge of character, but she prefers to form her opinions based on her own observations. I don't know why she wants to know more about you, but I would say that you have passed the test, whatever it is." Was. Jake just shook his head in confusion. Suddenly, his life seemed to spin out of control due to a dramatic turn of events. First, a miscarriage, then Catherine's depression, a shocking revelation from her doctor, and now a sudden call from the First Lady. He felt as if his carefully planned life had suddenly been thrown out of whack. Course. And now he had no control over where he was going or what might happen next. That evening, he told Catherine about his visit to the White House, and he was glad that she showed interest in what had happened. She wanted to know what the First Lady said and why she wanted to meet with Jake, but he couldn't provide any answers to the last question, and Catherine was just as confused as he was. Seeing Catherine more animated than she had been lately, Jake cautiously tried to return to the topic of what happened 2 years ago. But as soon as he raised the issue, she again reacted with a categorical denial that such a thing had ever happened, and her mood again turned into barely contained hostility. Realizing that nothing could be achieved, Jake went into the living room and tried to concentrate on the work he had brought home with him. But with all the questions swirling around his head, it was impossible to concentrate. Ultimately, he decided that he needed to see Dr. Liu again. Even if she didn't show him Catherine's medical records, he at least hoped to get her professional opinion on Catherine's denials. The next morning, Jake went to work at his usual time, but after visiting his secretary, he got back into the car and headed to Baltimore, to Johns Hopkins Hospital. The traffic was particularly heavy, and he believed there must be a traffic accident ahead when he noticed a police helicopter flying over a row of cars. Accordingly, he left the highway and took an alternative route using side streets. Arriving at Johns Hopkins Hospital, he went straight to Dr. Liu's office. But when he asked to see her, the receptionist looked at him with confusion. "Did you have an appointment, sir?" she asked. "No, my wife is her patient. I was hoping she could spare some time for me." "But she's not here," the young woman objected. "When is she coming back? If it doesn't take long, maybe I'll just wait for her," Jake replied. "We actually don't know when she'll be back," the receptionist said apologetically. Dr. Liu took a leave of absence. "I think she went to China, but I'm not sure. We were simply told to cancel all existing records and not make new ones until we received further instructions." Jake thanked the young woman and turned desperately to leave. "What should I do now?" he asked himself. He felt as if every possible path was blocked from him, and he found himself in a limbo of ignorance and suffering. So preoccupied with his thoughts, he paid no attention to his route and got onto 295 as he normally would to get back to Washington. When he noticed another police helicopter above him, he remembered the reason for his early detour. But this time, although the helicopter seemed to stick with him, he did not encounter any signs of an accident. He must be looking for someone, Jake thought as he pulled into his office garage. Later that day, Jake was interrupted by an incoming text message on his smartphone. To his surprise, it was from the First Lady. "Urgently need to meet privately this evening. Come to the intersection of Good Hope Road and 16th Street at 8 p.m. If I am late, please wait for me. SHP." What the hell does that mean? Jake asked himself. Why would the First Lady meet with me again, and why is this all a secret? What's going on? However, he sent a confirming response, then tried to call Catherine to let her know he would be late, but only received her voicemail, so he left a message without elaborating. He then tried to occupy himself with the work that had accumulated during his absence, drinking a few cups of coffee at his desk to stave off hunger. When it was time to go to his mysterious meeting, Jake went down to the garage and entered the specified address into the GPS system of his BMW. As he drove, his mind was filled with speculation as to why the First Lady might want to meet him under such mysterious circumstances. The more he thought about it, the less he could come up with any convincing reason. Suddenly, he looked around and assessed his location. The GPS system led him to the heart of Anacostia, one of the most seedy areas of the capital. Why the hell did the First Lady choose such a meeting place? He asked himself, but nevertheless continued driving until he reached an intersection. The intersection of 16th Avenue and Good Hope Road was shifted, and Jake wasn't sure what corner he should wait at. He decided to park on Good Hope in front of several darkened buildings. By that hour, it was dark, and the few working street lamps provided only limited illumination. Jake felt extremely vulnerable sitting in a parked car in that area, so he left the engine running and the doors locked. Every few minutes, a car passed through the intersection, but none of them stopped or even slowed down. Otherwise, the streets seemed deserted. There was no sound except the distant hum of a propeller-driven plane. Checking his watch, he asked himself, "How long will I have to wait?" But he knew that he was not going to refuse a meeting with the First Lady, although it was already later than the appointed time. As he sat there, Jake became increasingly aware of how much coffee he had drunk, and soon he began to squirm uncomfortably in his seat. After looking around, he did not see a place where there could be a public toilet, so he decided to steadfastly move it. But after a minute, he realized that waiting was no longer an option. If he didn't want to meet the president's wife in wet trousers, he had to go now. Cursing, he jumped out of the car and walked, bent slightly, into an alley between two dilapidated buildings. He found a spot in the dark shadows behind a pile of trash bags, unzipped his fly, and began to relieve himself. "I'm just like some damn homeless person," he scolded himself, looking around to make sure no one was looking. Just as he finished, a shadowy figure darted across the street and opened Jake's car door. At one point, the man jumped behind the wheel and started the engine. "Hey!" Jake shouted, hastily buttoning his fly. "Get out of my car!" As his BMW began to pull away from the side of the road, Jake turned to run after it, but only managed to take a couple of steps before a body slammed into him, knocking him back into a pile of trash bags. Jake tried to push the body away from him, only to recoil in surprise when his hands touched a woman's breasts. Before he could say a word, a hand covered his mouth and a woman's voice whispered in his ear, "Be quiet and don't move." When the woman loosened her grip, Jake hissed, "My car! He's stealing my car!" "Forget about the car," he heard in response. "If I'm not mistaken..." What she was about to say was interrupted by a hissing roar, accompanied by a streak of light that directly hit the driver of Jake's car. There was a powerful explosion, and the woman pounced on top of Jake. Even through her body, he felt the impact of the explosion, which was immediately followed by a wave of intense heat. A large piece of metal flew over his head and hit the brick wall directly above them. When the noise died down, Jake struggled to raise his head, and when he did, he saw that there was almost nothing left of his car except burning wreckage. Looking on in amazement, he saw a burning tire rolling down Good Hope Road. Jake was in shock, but the woman who attacked him was moving with purpose. She grabbed the large metal fragment and lifted it under her arm. She then turned and began to pull Jake along with her. "Come on," she said urgently. "Stay in the shadows as much as possible. I don't think they can use infrared after the explosion, so we should be fine." "Wait, where are we going? What's going on?" "There's no time to explain now. The damn thing is still up there. Besides, they've probably already sent a team to the site to confirm the murder." Confused, Jake followed the woman down an alley past several buildings until they reached U Street. The woman dragged him to a car parked there, and as soon as he fastened his seatbelt, she sped up without turning on her headlights. With the streetlights passing by, Jake recognized the woman as Helen Simmons. As the shock slowly wore off, it was replaced by anger. "What the hell was that?" Jake demanded to know. Helen kept her eyes on the road, occasionally looking up through the windshield to try to see the sky. "I'd say it was a Hellfire missile launched from a Predator drone, laser-guided, probably a 20-pound heat warhead. You should feel honored they brought out the big guns on you." While he was processing everything that had just happened, Jake's eyes suddenly widened. "What about that poor guy who stole my car?" he asked. Helen shrugged. "One less thief from Washington," she noted wittily. Then, glancing at Jake and seeing the expression on his face, she apologized. "Sorry for being flippant. This is really serious and I'm just as shocked as you are." Jake wasn't satisfied. "Easy for you to say. It was your boss who arranged for me to be killed tonight." Helen braked sharply and pulled the car to the side of the road. Angry, she turned to Jake. Mrs. Pressman had absolutely nothing to do with it. That text you received was not from her. Seeing the disbelief on his face, she continued, "Come on, Jake. Whoever heard of the First Lady setting up a meeting like this? She never sends text messages. Hell, I'm not even sure she knows how." When Jake looked down, she started the car again and continued driving. Suddenly, Jake's head shot up and he turned to the agent. "Wait a minute. What were you doing in that alley? Were you following me?" Helen nodded. "Actually, I've been keeping an eye on you for a few days now. Mrs. Pressman asked me to keep an eye on you." "Really? I never noticed you," he said in surprise. She smiled. "I didn't want you to notice me." Jake wasn't satisfied. "What about that helicopter I saw the other day? Was that you?" The smile disappeared from the agent's lips. "I wasn't the only one watching you, Jake." The adrenaline began to subside, and Jake sank into his seat, trembling slightly. "I don't understand what's going on anymore, Helen," he said quietly. "My life has gotten crazy, and I don't understand why this is happening." She looked at him and reached out to squeeze his hand. "I don't know either, Jake, but I think I can take you somewhere safe, where we can try to figure it out." A few minutes later, Helen arrived at a house on Foxhall Road, north of Georgetown. When they arrived at the gate, after she introduced herself, the gate quietly opened to let them in. "Where are we?" Jake asked in surprise. "This is Senator Hamilton's house. He's Mrs. Pressman's father. I think you'll be safe here. They probably think you were driving your car. Even if they don't think so, I don't think anyone dares to carry out a drone strike on the home of a U.S. senator." Helen led Jake to the door, where they were greeted by the butler, who was obviously expecting them. He led them into a room that appeared to be the breakfast room, although it was larger than Jake's living room. Sandwiches and mugs of beer were waiting for them at the table. Although Jake was not thinking about food, he realized that he was very hungry, and he and Helen began to eat with gusto. During their meal, Helen deliberately tried to steer the conversation away from the events of the evening. When it became clear that she would not talk about the attack, Jake asked Helen to tell him her story. She smiled. "Actually, it's a pretty short story. I'm from the prairies like you. My dad was a rancher in Montana, and I got an ROTC scholarship to Bozeman State University. After graduation, I enlisted in the Army and was sent to Afghanistan, where I was assigned to the military police. After I served my time, I tried my luck with the Secret Service. They gave preference to veterans and women, so I ended up here in Washington." Immediately, Mrs. Pressman appeared around the corner, and Jake and Helen stood up. The First Lady quickly walked up to Jake and grabbed both of his hands. "I'm so glad you're safe, Jake. It really upset me that my name was used to lure you into a trap, even though I didn't know it at the time." She sat down at the table with them. Looking at Jake, she said, "I still don't understand what's going on, but it seems like you've attracted an unusual amount of attention from several agencies of the federal government. I can only assume that your visit to Dr. Liu somehow triggered these events. But why should anyone care about a couple who lost a child due to miscarriage?" Jake asked questionably. "I don't know," the First Lady repeated, "but I kind of think the answer must be Johns Hopkins. If I'm right, there are two things I know about that place that might help you. Go first. In addition to being arguably the best hospital in the country, Johns Hopkins is also a leading biomedical research center, especially in the field of DNA research. What is not as widely known is that in connection with their research, they have records. The DNA of every patient they've treated over the last 10 years. That includes the DNA of every child and every fetus they've ever treated." Thinking about the implications of what Mrs. Pressman was saying, Jake's eyes widened. But before he could say anything, the First Lady continued. "The second thing you may not know is that I am a trustee of Johns Hopkins. I believe I can get you access to information that would otherwise not be available, at least without a court order." Jake involuntarily turned his gaze to Helen, who was just as amazed as he was. "Please be my guest tonight," Mrs. Pressman continued. "I think you'll be safe here. Besides, as far as I've been able to gather, the authorities believe you were the driver of the car." She smiled wryly. It will take them some time to collect enough remains to realize their mistake. Jake shuddered involuntarily. Helen, Mrs. Pressman continued, tomorrow I want you to take Jake to the Johns Hopkins Genetic Resource Center. I've already made a couple of calls that should pave the way. Maybe you can find out enough to stop the little war that seems to be playing out on the streets of the county. She smiled at both of them. In the meantime, I recommend that you get a good night's sleep. My father has enough bedrooms that no one will disturb you. They both said goodbye to the First Lady and then headed upstairs to the sleeping quarters. As he began to turn the doorknob to his room, Jake suddenly stopped. "Oh God, Helen, I'm sorry," he exclaimed. "What are you sorry?" she asked in bewilderment. "In all this madness and confusion, I never thanked you for saving my life," Jake said. With these words, he hugged her. Helen stepped back to look him in the face. "I was just doing my job, Jake," she said seriously. Then her face broke into a smile. "But I really liked it when you felt me up there in the alley," she added, and suddenly leaned over to give him a quick kiss on the cheek. She then turned and walked into her bedroom, leaving Jake standing there in amazement. The next morning, Mrs. Pressman joined them again for breakfast, and while they ate, she had news for them. "I did a little digging this morning. You'll be interested to know that the Washington Post is reporting yesterday's incident as a gas tank explosion," she said with a mirthless smile. "The driver has not yet been publicly identified, but it is significant that your surveillance appears to have been lifted." Helen and Jake exchanged dark glances. The First Lady had more to say. "Since they don't seem to be looking for you anymore, let's not give them a reason to reconsider their decision. I still think you should go to Hopkins, but let's switch roles for your visit. Helen, I need you to be my assistant this morning. I made a few calls and they're waiting for you at the Genetic Resource Center. Jake, you'll be Helen's driver. You can use one of my dad's cars. I hope it doesn't cause any unwanted attention." After breakfast, Jake put on a dark jacket and chauffeur's cap and, raising his hat, hurried to open the door for Helen, who acknowledged his knighthood with a broad smile. As they set off, Jake looked at Helen, and his face took on a serious expression. "I still don't understand why we're going back to Hopkins or what exactly we're looking for. Do you know?" Helen kept in her circle a large envelope of information that Mrs. Pressman had given her. "Mrs. Pressman has a list of information we should request from GRCF. Hopefully the answers will help us understand what's going on. Let's focus on getting help from the hospital for now, then we'll figure out what to do about it." When Jake finally found the GRCF in the maze of buildings that make up Johns Hopkins, the worn brick exterior hid the advanced work going on inside. A researcher was already waiting for them at the check-in counter. Leading them down a long corridor, he said, "I have been tasked with helping you with whatever you need." When they reached a small waiting room in front of a much larger laboratory, Helen explained that they needed a DNA test on Jake, who looked surprised by this turn of events. Nevertheless, he agreed to have his hair sample taken. But before the researcher could leave, Helen handed him a second bag containing another hair sample. "We'll need to test this sample as well, please. Then we'll need to compare both samples to the DNA from those two samples, which I assume you already have on file. We need a probability of a relationship for everyone." With that, she handed the man a piece of paper with 2 long alphanumeric codes on it. The researcher looked at the numbers and, recognizing the standard DNA sample identification numbers for the faculty, nodded in understanding and quickly left the room. Jake turned to Helen with confusion. "Wouldn't it take days, if not weeks, to test these samples and compare them?" he asked. "That would be true under normal circumstances," Helen replied, "but we're in a cutting-edge research facility with capabilities that most DNA labs don't have. And don't forget, the request for help came from a hospital trustee. My boss thinks that they can give us results within an hour and a half." Jake whistled in admiration. But he had other questions. "So what were those numbers you gave him? And where did that other hair sample come from?" Instead of answering, Helen glanced towards the corner of the room, and as Jake followed her gaze, he noticed the CCTV camera. Helen then shook her head, signaling him not to ask any more questions. Time passed as slowly for them as it did for any patient stuck waiting at the doctor's office, but finally, the researcher returned and handed Helen an envelope. "I think you will find everything you need here. Give our regards to Mrs. Pressman and let her know if you were satisfied with our answer." "Oh, we're definitely satisfied," Helen said with a grateful smile, "and we'll be sure to let Mrs. Pressman know about your help." With that, Helen and Jake left the facility and began their trek back to the county. While Jake drove, Helen kept the envelope containing the information on her lap, and although Jake was eager to know the contents, she cautioned him to wait until they were back at Hamilton's hideout. When they finally passed through the gate, Jake and Helen hurried towards the house. The butler met them at the door and led them into the living room. There they found Mrs. Pressman waiting for them. Helen handed the envelope to the First Lady, who carefully opened it. She pulled out 2 sheets of paper and looked at them thoughtfully. She then handed them to Jake, who looked at them blankly before passing them back to Savannah Pressman. "I don't understand any of this. What does it mean?" he asked cautiously. The First Lady held up one of the sheets so he could see it. "Subject A is you," she said softly. "This is your DNA. The alphanumeric code you see below is the DNA number of the fetus your wife aborted about 2 years ago. Analysis shows that you were the father of this fetus." At her words, Jake couldn't help but sigh heavily. "I was afraid. I thought it could have been someone else's child," he said. Then, as the 2 women looked at him, he suddenly realized the consequences and his relief turned to anger. "But this means that she aborted my child. Why would she do this? I wanted a child so bad. We both wanted it." Tears began to form in his eyes, and he wiped them away angrily. He glanced at Helen and Mrs. Pressman, who were sitting quietly. Noticing the solemn expression on their faces, he pointed to the second sheet. "What does he says?" he demanded. "This is the DNA code of the fetus that Catherine miscarried during the Easter egg. The analysis excludes Subject A as the father, but confirms the paternity of Subject B." "How can it be?" Jake asked, angry and confused. Then a dark expression appeared on his face. "Who is Subject B? Where did this hair sample come from?" he asked angrily. Mrs. Pressman looked at him with worried eyes. "I'm afraid I'm responsible for this, Jake," she said quietly. "I took this sample from my husband's hairbrush." Jake looked at her incredulously. "My wife is the president's mistress? Did she carry his child?" He fell onto the sofa, his shoulders slumping as if weighed down by a heavy weight. Tears flowed freely now as the shock of the revelations mixed with the tension he had been under for weeks. Helen came and sat next to him and took his hand, and Mrs. Pressman came over to get him some tissues. After a while, he regained control of himself and looked at them with determination in his eyes. Helen sensed this and quickly asked in a worried voice, "What are you going to do now, Jake?" "I'm going to go home and meet my future ex-wife." Helen looked worriedly at the First Lady, who quickly spoke. "Jake, I would feel a lot better if you stayed here. I'm not sure yet that it's safe for you to be outside the house. I wouldn't want to hear about another accident." He looked at her, then at Helen, who nodded vigorously. "Okay," he admitted, "but I'll call her. It's killing me. I can't hold it in anymore." The 2 women exchanged glances. Helen then reached into her bag and pulled out her cell phone. "Use this," she told Jake. "This is disposable junk that has never been used, so this number should not raise an alarm at the NSA." Handing him the letter, she added, "But don't talk for long, just in case." Jake took the phone and walked out onto the patio behind the house. When he dialed Catherine's cell phone, it rang for a while before a hesitant female voice answered, "Yes. Who is it?" "It's me, Jake, the husband you thought was dead." "Jake," she squealed. "I was so worried about you. Where have you been? I tried to call you, but I only had a recording. Stop," Jake roared. "I don't want to go through the couple in love routine with you anymore. I know everything about you and your lover. And I know whose baby it was when you miscarried. I also know that it was my child that you aborted 2 years ago." "But Jake," objected Catherine. Jake interrupted her again. "I don't want to hear any more of your lies, and I sure as hell don't want to hear any more excuses. I just want you to know that as soon as I can start filing the paperwork, I will be filing for divorce. Oh, and in case you were wondering, I won't be filing a lawsuit based on irreconcilable differences," he added. "That would be adultery to the fullest extent." "Jake, wait!" Catherine begged him. "Don't do anything hasty. We need to talk, please." "Why? So you can let another drone deal with me? Do you want this?" he asked angrily. "What are you talking about?" "I don't know anything about any drones," she said heatedly. "Okay, have it your way," he said angrily. "But either way, I want you out of my life as quickly as possible." "Just wait until tomorrow," she pleaded. "Don't do anything until... As far as I'm concerned, you're no longer my wife, if you ever were," he said bitterly. "And you can't ask me for anything now or ever again." With that, he hung up, wanting to find a way to turn off his cell phone. When he returned inside, Helen was waiting. "How was it?" she asked sympathetically. "Pretty much what you'd expect," Jake said. "It was all denial and delay. I didn't know anything. We need to talk. Take your time." Seeing the play of emotions on his face, she took his hand and led him inside to the lair. "You need to try to take your mind off all this chaos for a while. There is a ball game on TV. Watch it with me. We'll see how bad the Nationals are this season. I made us some sandwiches and thought I saw some imported beer in the fridge." Jake reluctantly allowed her to take charge. But to his surprise, after a while, he felt himself relaxing while watching the game. He even exchanged snarky comments with her about how instant replay was ruining the game. For the most part, he found himself able to compartmentalize his emotions. The only time the pain threatened to come out was when he had to watch commercials depicting happy families playing. Helen wisely did not try to interfere, but gently steered him back to more harmless topics when the opportunity presented itself. At the end of the evening, Helen walked Jake back to his room. At the door, she hugged him. "Things will get better, Jake, I promise. You took the first step by knowing the truth. Now at least you know what you're dealing with." "I hope you're right, Helen, but it was all so overwhelming," he said. She stood and watched sympathetically as he closed the door. She knew that he would have to wait a long time for sleep. The next morning, the two of them were having breakfast when the butler suddenly appeared. "There's a gentleman from the Federal Bureau of Investigation standing at the door," he said solemnly. "He says he'd like to talk to Mr. Phillips." "What should I tell him?" Jake and Helen looked at each other. Then a determined look appeared on Jake's face. "I'll be right there," he said. "Wait a second," Helen said, and put on a shoulder holster with a black Sig Sauer. She then followed Jake to the door and stopped where her weapon was visible. The man at the front door waited patiently with his hands folded in front of him. When Jake opened the door, the man showed Jake his credentials and politely asked, "Mr. Jacob Phillips?" When Jake acknowledged him, the agent continued, "Sir, the President of the United States would like to see you at the White House immediately. I was ordered to take you there." Jake looked at Helen again and she said something to him. "I'm ready to go to the White House right now," Jake told the man, "but I prefer my own transportation." The agent shrugged. "As you wish, sir," he said, turned and left. Jake and Helen quickly got ready and rushed towards Pennsylvania Avenue. "I don't think they'll do anything right now," she told Jake, "but I'm going to go the most public route. It won't hurt to be on the safe side." "I wonder how they knew where I was," Jake asked. "I think we underestimated how badly they wanted to find you," Helen said. "They must have held a full-blown press conference right after your call to Catherine yesterday." When they got to the White House, the agent they had met earlier was waiting for him. Helen reached out and squeezed Jake's hand. "Good luck," she said, and then he walked up the steps to the entrance. The agent led Jake through ornate hallways until they turned into a small office with nothing inside except a desk and what looked like an airport metal detector. "Your mobile phone, please," the agent asked. Jake reluctantly handed it over because he hoped to record his meeting with the president. The agent then asked, "Are you wearing a wire?" Jake shook his head. "Any electronic devices?" Again, no. "Do you have a pacemaker?" "No," Jake said. "What is it?" The agent pointed to a device next to the table with a sly grin. "If you have any kind of electronic device, this baby will fry it, and maybe you will too." As he pointed to the device, Jake nervously walked through it, but without incident. The agent then led him down the hallway and held the door open so he could enter what was undoubtedly the Oval Office. "Come in and sit down. The president will be with you soon." Jakey walked over to one of the chairs in front of the president's desk and sat down. After a moment, he began to look around. Even though Catherine had worked as an assistant to the president for half a dozen years, Jake had never seen the Oval Office before, and he couldn't help but marvel at being in that seat of world power. It's easy to understand how one can get carried away by all this, he thought. At that moment, the door behind him opened, and when Jake turned to look, he saw the unmistakable figure of Calvin Pressman walking towards him. Even though he now hated the man standing before him, Jake automatically rebelled out of instinctive respect for the position Pressman held. The president didn't offer to shake Jake's hand or say a word. Instead, he invited Jake to follow him. They walked through a door Jake hadn't even noticed, walked through the lobby, out a second door, and suddenly found themselves in the bright sunlight of a late spring day on the back lawn of the White House. "This is the best place for us to talk," the president said, but when Jake began to answer, the big man raised his hand in silence. He then spoke, seemingly out in the open. "Don't write it down. This conversation is privileged, private, and confidential." Jake looked around but didn't see anything that could record their conversation. Then the president walked, and Jake hurried after him. "I like that side of it," Pressman said. "Everyone talks about the Rose Garden, but at this time of year I think the Kennedy Garden is more beautiful." Jake looked at the taller man and said bluntly, "I don't think you called me here to discuss spring flowers, Mr. President." Pressman grinned slightly. "We don't need to beat around the bush with you, Jake." "Well, you're right, of course. I brought you here to talk about Catherine." Jake felt anger boiling inside him. "I know everything about you and Catherine," he said hotly. "You don't know a damn thing." The president spat, but Jake didn't mind. "I know you tried to kill me with a drone strike so you could take her for yourself," Jake replied. The president's anger subsided, and an expression of almost embarrassment appeared on his face. "I'm sorry about that, Jake. It was a mistake. I got upset and said some harsh things about you in the company of the wrong people. I think they took me too seriously." Jake stared at him and then said sarcastically, "Oh, of course I understand. Just like Henry II and Thomas Becket." Seeing Pressman looking at him in confusion, Jake continued, "You know when the king asked his minions, 'Will no one rid me of this annoying priest?'" "Whatever," Pressman replied dismissively. "Anyway, I brought you here to talk about my heritage. I've accomplished almost everything I set out to achieve, and I think history will treat me very well indeed. But the only thing I'm missing is an heir, and unfortunately my wife is barren. That's why I need Catherine." "Wait," Jake countered. "If you weren't happy with your wife, why didn't you just divorce her?" Pressman looked at Jackie like he was the vile idiot. "Divorce her. Do you know how many votes her father has in the Senate? Without Horatio Hamilton's support, I would never have been able to get my agenda through Congress. Hell, I never would have gotten this nomination." Jake's first reaction was contempt, but then suddenly what the president had said dawned on him, and Jake was shocked. "Nomination?" he asked. "Even during the primaries? How long has this thing been going on between you and Catherine?" An expression of satisfaction appeared on the president's face. "We fell in love during my first party nomination even before she met you. You have to admit, we did a good job keeping this a secret," he said proudly. Jake was stunned. "But why did Catherine marry me if you were both in love with each other?" Now Pressman grinned openly. "Don't you see? You were the perfect cover. She could have been working next to me all this time. And since you two are married, no one would suspect anything. But your wife, The Secret Service, the media, Jake countered. How could you, get together without people knowing about it? Pressman winked at him. There are ways, places away from the Secret Service, rooms without wires, trips abroad, even on Air Force One. It didn't happen that often, but we managed. His expression suddenly sobered. But you kept pushing Catherine to start a family, and she finally agreed to go off the pill to make you happy. What you didn't know was that she started using the diaphragm whenever you wanted to have sex. They say these things are 94% effective. I think 2 years ago, you and Catherine were in that 6%. Anyway, when she got pregnant, we knew the baby wasn't mine because of timing, so we arranged for her to have an abortion, the one you learned about at Hopkins. Jake felt dizzy as he tried to understand everything Pressman was telling him. She was on birth control this whole time, but this can't be true. She got pregnant last winter. Pressman could barely contain himself. I said she used the diaphragm with you. I didn't say she used it with me. After her abortion, we decided we couldn't risk another accident, so we moved up the schedule to give me my heir. Our plan would have worked perfectly if she hadn't had a miscarriage. Jake stood there with his mouth open. He simply could not understand that his entire marriage had been a sham and that the woman he thought loved him had deceived him so cruelly and for so long. Pressman started walking again, and Jakey had to scramble to catch up with him. Anyway, it's all in the past. I want to talk about the future. I don't want to hear any more talk from you about divorcee. Everything will remain the same. You and Catherine will remain married. Soon she will become pregnant again, and you will act like a proud father. Either way, Catherine will get pregnant, and you two will raise the child as your own for the next 2 years. Then, after I finish my second term in office, I will quietly divorce Savannah, and you and Catherine will separate. She will have sole custody of the child. After a decent amount of time, Catherine and I will get married, and I will adopt a child and change his name to Pressman. I planned it all. Jake stared at the big guy, wondering if he was crazy. What makes you think I would ever collude with you in this crazy scheme? Why don't I leave today and go straight to the Washington Center? Just tell them the whole story, he demanded angrily. The president gave Jake a piercing look. Over the years, I realized that if you want to achieve something, it is better to use both the carrot and the stick. So tell me, Jake, would you agree with me if I could make your wildest dream come true? What if I gave you the dream of almost every lawyer in the country, as well as a guarantee of financial security for the rest of your life? Now Jake was completely confused and looked at Pressman incomprehensibly. The big guy was now on a roll. He took Jake by the shoulder and pointed toward the south lawn. Look over there through the trees at Constitution Avenue. This is the Ministry of Justice. How would you like your oil portrait to hang there, Jake? The current CEO still wants to retire. How would you like to be my attorney general? Over the next 2 years, you will be the most senior legal advisor in the country. And when the new president is sworn in, every law firm in the country will gladly hire you at an astronomical salary. Or if that's not the life you want, you could probably become the dean of almost any law school you like. The world would be your oyster. All you have to do is keep everything exactly as it was for 2 more years, and it could all be yours. What are you gonna say? Before Jake could respond, a figure emerged from the White House and waved frantically at the president. Pressman nodded and turned back to Jake. I have to go. I made the French ambassador wait for more than 30 minutes. He chuckled slightly. All this would be much easier if I were the president of France. They have a completely different attitude towards matters of the heart than we do in this country. In any case, think about what I suggest. With these words, the big man left for the meeting, leaving Jake standing among the flowers in Kennedy's garden. Then an FBI agent appeared and, after returning Jake's cell phone, led him back through the White House to where Helen was waiting impatiently in the car. After he got into the car, it pulled away from the side of the road and soon found itself in midday traffic. Well, what did he want? What did he say? She asked impatiently. Jake looked out the windshield with a thoughtful expression on his face. I have a lot to think about, he said. 3 months later, the reporter stood on the steps of the Senate building, listening intently to the tiny speaker in her ear. When she heard the producer's line, she began speaking to the camera in front of her. This is CNN News reporting live from Capitol Hill, where the Judiciary Committee will soon begin confirmation hearings for Jacob Phillips. As is widely known, if confirmed, Phillips would become the youngest Attorney General in U.S. history. But with President Pressman's support, these hearings became a mere formality. She pressed her fingers to her ear and then said, "I was told that the hearings are already underway, so we will now go live to the Senate floor where the hearings are taking place." The hearing room was filled with the sounds of people taking their seats and exchanging hushed comments. Jake, who was sitting at the table facing the panel of senators, looked back and saw Catherine sitting behind him, her belly already beginning to show. She smiled and gave him a thumbs up. At this point, Senator Horatio Hamilton, chairman of the Judiciary Committee, called the meeting to order and announced that the nominee had requested an opportunity to make brief initial remarks. As he gestured, Jake cleared his throat and leaned toward the microphone in front of him. "Ladies and gentlemen of the Judiciary Committee, I am honored to appear before you as a nominee for Attorney General of the United States of America. Every lawyer in the country dreams of one day holding this important position, and I can assure you that I am no exception. The purpose of this hearing, of course, is for you to learn more about me, my legal philosophy, and my influence. It is this last topic that I would like to talk about now, but instead of legal scholars or political scientists, the influence I would like to mention is the poet T.S. Eliot, and especially his masterpiece Murder in the Cathedral." Jake heard noise in the room, but continued. "As you, of course, know, the play tells the story of the murder of Archbishop Thomas Becket by agents of Henry II, because Thomas disobeyed the will of the king. But the crime was not the play's main focus. Instead, Eliot wanted us to confront the theme of temptation. You see, Becket had options before the murder, some of which could have brought him fame, power, wealth, or security. But Becket rejected them all, declaring that the greatest treason is doing the right thing for the wrong reason. I think Becket and Eliot were right. It is a sin to do the right thing for the wrong reason. And for this reason, I hereby withdraw my candidacy for the position of Attorney General. I do this because my candidacy was not a recognition of merit or ability, and not a cold, calculated bribe that I cannot and will not accept." There was shouting in the room as photographers pushed each other to take pictures. But Senator Hamilton restored order and motioned for Jake to continue. "You are probably asking yourself why I waited so long to reject this nomination, and why I chose such a public forum to do so. The answer is that it was the only way to be sure of what I should do, to say what cannot be suppressed, hidden, or explained. It is vital that I have this opportunity because I hereby charge Calvin Arthur Pressman, President of the United States, with high crimes and misdemeanors." A collective gasp filled the Senate chamber, followed by screams from the media and angry outbursts from many of the senators present. But the chairman once again called for order, and at his signal, the microphones of the remaining senators were turned off. He then calmly encouraged Jake to continue. "Ladies and gentlemen, these are my charges. The president authorized the use of a military drone to attack a U.S. citizen on United States soil. If not for the interference of others, he would have succeeded. The president acted illegally because he maintained an intimate relationship with my wife for a long time, trying to get an heir. When I got too close to the truth about this relationship, he tried to kill me. When this attempt failed, he tried to buy my silence by offering me the post of prosecutor general. Regardless of whatever investigations this Congress makes or whatever decisions it makes on these matters, I will file for divorce from my wife, Catherine, on the ground of adultery, and I will name the president as a co-defendant. These are extremely serious allegations, and you have every reason to doubt their veracity. Accordingly, I now intend to hand over the evidence gathered over the past 3 months to the members of the committee and the ladies and gentlemen of the media. In the first section, you will find irrefutable DNA evidence of a sexual relationship between the president and my wife. In the second section, you'll find the evidence we developed regarding the DC drone attack, including a photo of the tail of the Hellfire missile that was fired at me in the Anacostia area. As you will see, the serial number and other markings have been preserved, allowing us to pinpoint its source and details of its use. Helen, could you give it away? These envelopes? Helen Simmons nodded and gave Jake a tight smile before she began handing out envelopes. There was an immediate riot as senators and reporters rushed to take one of the envelopes. Jake looked back at his wife, who was desperately trying to avoid the questions of the reporters surrounding her. Then he looked at Senator Hamilton. "Mr. Chairman," he said, "this concludes my opening remarks." The senator looked at Jake and nodded. Then the old man looked into the gallery. Jake followed his gaze and noticed the First Lady standing with her arms crossed at the entrance to the highest level of the room. When she saw the two men looking at her, she nodded to them with grim satisfaction and then retreated through the doorway behind her. After finishing filling up the tank, Jake went to the gas station to pay the attendant. These days, he mostly uses cash rather than credit cards, staying off the grid as much as possible. He knew they could still find him if they wanted, but he didn't want to make it easy. He was driving instead of flying for the same reason. He hadn't checked the news for several days, but when he noticed a Copy USA today on the counter, he impulsively took a copy. The front page featured a large photograph of a wooden-faced Cap Pressman being escorted by federal marshals. The headline read, "Pressman heads to the paddock." The subtitle added, "First president ever convicted of a felony while in office." Jake laughed mockingly. He always wanted to be in the history books. Looks like his wish came true. As he walked out, he looked at the blue, cloudless sky in the west. It had become a habit, but today he saw nothing but an airliner about 8 miles overhead. Nevertheless, he quickly stepped under the roof above the pumps. He returned to the car and passed a can of ice-cold soda through the open window. "Thank you," Helen said. "How long until we get to Nebraska?" He looked out over the flat prairie plain before them. "I'd say we have another hour before we reach the Missouri River," he told her. When he got into the car and started the engine, she squeezed his hand with concern. "Any doubts about coming back here, Jake? After all, Pressman still has friends in Oklahoma." He smiled at her. "I'm not worried. The Cornhuskers and Sooners have always been rivals." Then he became serious. "Besides, do you know what the Nebraska state motto is?" When she shook her head, he told her, "Equality before the law." Nebraskans don't like officials who think they are above the law, either here or in Washington. "Okay, but I'm still worried about you," she said. He reached out and squeezed her hand. "I'll be fine as long as you have my back. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one. 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 Listening to the next one.